Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. And on behalf of the National Archives and the Foundation, happy July 4th. What a day. Thanks for spending part of your holiday with us. The grills are getting warm. I think some popsicles are melting. And we've got folks from all over the country who have joined us. It's a great day to pick the National Archives to celebrate our independence. Fast fact. Do you know what the first records that are held in the National Archives are around the Revolution? It's the Oath of Allegiance. These are small cards that General George Washington, his officers, and his troops all signed to disavow the King of England and show their support for the Revolution. Where did they sign them? Valley Forge, that snowy winter in 1777. Pretty cool. You know what else is in the archives? Maps from exhibitions, military records, NASA's plans to go to the moon, Native American treaties, comic books, civil rights records, presidential orders, and tweets. And we have a few emails. I like to say the archives hold so many emails, they make Google blush. The archives is really the home of our country's memory. We've had a lot of fun all day with our previous programs, and our next guest will be taking some questions. So I hope you've got your chat box up next to your YouTube video. And if you'd like to give it a whirl right now, tell us where you're viewing from. We'd love to hear from you, and I'll give you a shout out in a little bit. So ask your questions while she's speaking. If you think of things you're curious about, we'll get them in the chat. And then when we get to the Q&A, obviously you can continue to add your questions there. Now it's time to introduce our special guest. She is a woman of influence during the country's founding. She has a famous last name. She witnessed quite a bit, and she crossed paths with many who were quite intriguing. This is Mrs. Dorothy Hancock. Mrs. Hancock, happy July 4th to you. How are you today?
Well, happy Independence Day. Oh, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Very good. Tell us about yourself.
Well, actually, you said I had one famous last name. I actually have two famous last names. I'm Dorothy Hancock, but I'm also first Dorothy Quincy Hancock of the Massachusetts Quincys. Well, I'm quite certain you've heard very little about me, but you certainly may have heard of my husband, first President of the United States of America, John Hancock. You were expecting me to say George Washington. Well, 'tis true, under the United States Constitution, General Washington was elected to be the first president in 1789. But 14 years prior to that, in 1775, my then fiancé, John Hancock, a Boston merchant, went to Philadelphia to serve as the president of the Second Continental Congress. It was a year into his tenure as president of that body that on July 4th, 1776, the world would see in writing for the first time the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. It was my husband's gloriously flourished signature as president of that body that adorned that document. I am proud to say that I was there too. Well, not actually in the halls of Congress, no ladies allowed, but I was one of very few congressional wives who were able to accompany their husbands while they attended to the work of the American Congress. Indeed, I spent my honeymoon in Philadelphia and served for many months unofficially as my husband's corresponding clerk. Well, come to think of it, my relation to Mr. Hancock has placed me in the thick of things on many an occasion. Oh, goodness. Our long courtship officially began in Boston in 1771, shortly after the events which became known as the Boston Massacre. This coincided with his ever-growing participation in the movement to colonial self-determination, a move which I had grown up with. American independence had long been championed by my father, Judge Edmund Quincy, again, of the Massachusetts Quincys. My father heartily approved of the match between Mr. Hancock and myself. You see, John Hancock was not just a wealthy leading merchant in the city of Boston. He had grown to be a political leader as well. He was so well thought of to the patriot cause that he was selected to give the annual Massacre Day commemoration speech on March 5th, 1774. He gave a public call to patriotic action, to fight against tyranny and unite as a people who would fight for fair treatment. Yeah. Some boast of being friends to government. I am a friend of righteous government, founded upon the principles of reason and justice, but I glory in avowing my eternal enmity to tyranny. Is the present system which the British administration have adopted in the colonies a righteous government, or is it tyranny? When the crowd assembled shouted, "Tyranny!" Patriotism is ever united with humanity and compassion. This noble affection which impels us to sacrifice everything dear, even life itself, involves in it a common sympathy and tenderness for every citizen, and must ever have a particular feeling for one who suffers in a public cause. Therefore, let us also be ready to take the field whenever danger calls. Let us be united and strengthen the hands of each other by promoting a general union among us. Much has been done by the committees of correspondence for this and other towns of this province toward uniting the inhabitants. Let them still go on and prosper. Much has been done by the committees of correspondence for the houses of assembly in this and sister colonies, for uniting the inhabitants of the whole continent, for the security of their common interest. I have the most animating confidence that the present noble struggle for liberty will terminate gloriously in America. Well, shortly after this speech, the same committees of correspondence of our sister colonies would indeed convene a Congress in Philadelphia. John's health prevented him from attending the first Congress, but he would be well enough to heed the call in the spring of 1775. He and I had an unofficial understanding by then, and as his betrothed, I lived within his household, but under the chaperoning wing of our beloved aunt, Lydia Hancock. As we all made preparations for his departure, his association and work with Sam Adams in the Massachusetts militia placed me in the position to witness what may now be considered the official start of our revolution, the shot heard round the world, the battles of Lexington and Concord. Warrant was issued for Mr. Hancock and Mr. Sam Adams. The British lobsterbacks hoped that with these two gentlemen, they would also find a cache of weapons, powder, and a few artillery cannons the Americans had recently liberated from British control. We affectionately had named the cannon Hancock and one of the other ones Adams. Unable to meet in Boston, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was assembled in nearby Concord. Mr. Hancock, Aunt Lydia, and I had all moved to the neighboring town of Lexington. We stayed at his childhood home, a parsonage there. Oh, but his childhood is a longer story for another day. On April 18th, we knew that the British had moved from Boston. By April 19th, Paul Revere and his company had sent the alarm through the countryside. The regulars are coming! The regulars are coming! The bells rang and Mr. Hancock had prepared to stay and fight. Fortunately, on that occasion, Mr. Sam Adams had the cooler head which prevailed. He reminded my fiancé that the soldiering was not their business. They were now meant for the cabinet. Before the British arrived in Lexington, Hancock and Adams were on the road to Concord. As the redcoats marched into the village, I recall scurrying about the parsonage, helping to hide money and silver and anything of value. When the shots began, Aunt Lydia poked her head out the door and a musket ball winged so close by her. Oh, but it landed harmlessly in the barn door. 2 wounded soldiers were brought to the parsonage and we attended to them as best we could. They would live, but 6 other men from Lexington would not be so lucky. After the commotion abated, Mr. Hancock sent for Aunt Lydia and I to join him in Concord. Oh, he also reminded us to bring the fine salmon that was to be for supper that evening. So Aunt Lydia, myself, and the fine salmon were on the road to Concord. No sooner did we arrive than the alarm was up that the British were on their way to Concord. There was a spy in the ranks, but we knew not who. Either way, Mr. Hancock and Mr. Adams had to depart in haste again. They had not the time for supper in Concord, and while Aunt Lydia and I enjoyed that fine salmon in Concord, my poor fiancé suffered through a dinner of cold sausage and porridge in Woburn. As we counted our casualties, I wanted to return to my father's home in Boston. John forbade me to go, though, and I wanted to put my foot down by reminding him that we were not yet married, so I was not yet under his control. Eventually, he persuaded me that Connecticut was a much safer place for the time being. Even my father had made to flee Boston. The British officers were taking up residence in all the finest houses. John's, of course, among them. John made his way to Philadelphia for the early summer to begin his tenure as the president of the Second Continental Congress assembled there. He returned to Connecticut, though, and on August 28th, we were married. Off we went on our honeymoon to Philadelphia. We would barely ever be apart again, though. John wanted to have been given the command of the army, but that honor went to General Washington. Again, Mr. Hancock was meant for the cabinet. Correspondence and coordination of all aspects of the army, troop movements, materials, money, all needed to be approved by Congress, and a man of Mr. Hancock's considerable talents in management and logistic skills, skills he had learned in his trade as a merchant, were much needed at this time. I could be of great use to him, both as a wife and a clerk. You see, it was not until some months after this time that Mr. Hancock would keep an official clerk. I was for months engaged with my scissors, trimming off the rough edges of the bills of credit issued by Congress and letters signed by the president, packing them into saddlebags and addressing them to be sent to various quarters by use of the army. Finally, in the late spring of 1776, the real question of independence was presented by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. I'm not terribly political in my conversations, but we all knew John Adams had a hand in the resolve. We also understood that in order for the motion to garner the public assent of the middle and southern colonies, the resolution had to come from outside of Boston and outside of New England. So Virginia made the motion and Massachusetts seconded it. When the question of unanimity came up, my husband had to break a tie in favor of unanimity on the vote for independence. We could not have the colonies in dissent of one another. He then presided over many hours of debate. Finally, on July 2nd, 1776, a unanimous vote was achieved with one abstention from New York. 2 days later, on July 4th, the written declaration was approved. For the longest time, a full month passed, and only 2 names adored the Dunlap printing of the Declaration of Independence. My husband's, John Hancock, as president of the Congress, along with that of Charles Thompson of Pennsylvania as secretary. The only 2 names to appear to declare open treason against the British Crown. Eventually, an engrossed copy would be signed by all members of the Congress. No signature was as bold and recognizable, though, as that of my husband. John Hancock appeared so large that even King George could read it without his spectacles. By January 1777, a fully signed copy would be printed and sent to all the states. Each was accompanied by a letter from the president. As there is not a more distinguished event in the history of America than the declaration of her independence, nor any that in all probability will so much excite attention of future ages, it is highly proper that the memory of the transaction, together with the causes that give rise to it, should be preserved in the most careful manner that can be devised, that it may henceforth form a part of the archives of your state and remain a lasting testimony of your approbation of that necessary and important measure. America had set her sights on independence, and we needed the approbation not just of our sisterhood of colonies, but also of the world. We would next need to secure 2 things. One was an agreement of confederation between the states, which heralded a central union. The 14 states might act as one nation. The Articles of Confederation, championed by my husband, would not be fully realized until 1781. First, though, to secure independence and to act as a nation on the world stage, we needed to secure alliances with other powerful world partner nations, such as France and Spain. My husband spent much of his remaining time in his congressional chair of president to set such alliances in motion. Foremost, we would court France, that country's ages-old acrimony to England, along with its great wealth and military might, held the most promise for assistance to our American cause. Congressional delegates, the likes of Franklin, Dean, and eventually Adams, John Adams, not Samuel, would be sent to France to work on our behalf. The years in the president's chair took its toll on my husband. By October 1777, he penned his farewell address to Congress. He concluded by saying, "May every happiness, gentlemen, attend you, both as members of this House and as individuals. And I pray heaven that unanimity and perseverance may go hand in this House, and that everything which may tend to distract or divide your counsels be forever banished." Mr. Hancock and I returned to Boston just in time to receive the news that the French would indeed help with our American cause. John's health had improved, so he could take up his most desired position as a commander of American forces. He was a major general of the Massachusetts militia. In the summer of 1778, his troops marched to join continental forces in Rhode Island, where it was expected that the British fleet, under the command of Comte de Taine, would rout British forces from the coast of southern New England. Unfortunately, the weather was not cooperative, and a tremendous gale, a hurricane perhaps, prevented the French fleet from landing. Well, the same gale also prevented the British from landing, and both fleets were heavily damaged by the storm. The French put into Boston for much needed repairs. Past prejudices, though, and animosity between New Englanders and the French almost conspired to destroy our hard-fought alliance before it had even begun. Understandably, many Bostonians recalled being at war against the French but 15 years prior. Then, though, they were subjects of Great Britain during the French and Indian War. There was also mistrust of papist settlements in our western reaches. We needed to move past these old animosities. If the American people were to throw off the yoke of British rule, we would need the French to help us, and therefore we would need to make friends. A somewhat unfair charge had been made that the French had abandoned the American forces off the coast of Rhode Island. Boston craftsmen were refusing to assist the French in rebuilding their damaged fleet. The French even had to cook for themselves. Hostilities grew so bad that on September 8th, a riot broke out on the docks over some bread, if you can imagine. An important favorite of the French king was killed in that melee. This could not continue. If the Comte de Taine would have determined to remove his fleet, his men, the arms, and the money from our cause, it would have spelled disaster. My husband and I set to work. Every evening, we would invite French officers to our home for a fine dinner and engagement in conversation with our American friends. Each dinner averaged a cost of £300, a princely sum that John paid out of his own pocket, but one that he considered a necessary personal sacrifice and contribution to the cause of independence. We would prove to the French officers that Americans could indeed be civil, and we would also prove to our American associates that the French could and should be trusted as friends. In a particular response to that fateful French bread riot, we invited 30 officers and midshipmen for breakfast. Imagine my surprise when I was notified that there were 150 French soldiers on their way up to Beacon Hill. We set to work. We spread 12 pounds of butter onto bread. I asked all of the neighbors to send cake, and I directed the dairy maids to milk every cow on the common. Mr. Hancock and I would make up the difference to their owners later. The Frenchmen ate voraciously. One sailor reportedly drank 17 cups of tea at the table. Well, we repaired relations with diplomacy and good food. Mistrust and animosity had been turned into faith and friendship. Before the French departed Boston, with all their ships repaired, Mr. Hancock sponsored a grand event at Faneuil Hall for all. Even my cousin Abigail, Mrs. John Adams, was pleased with the event and could find no fault with it. The Comte de Tang gave my husband a public pledge that the French fleet would never again fail the Americans. And in another few years, they would prove their promise and their mettle at the Battle of Yorktown, thus sealing the victory for George Washington and the United States of America against Cornwallis and Great Britain. My husband, and by extension myself, have given much to secure American independence. May we all continue to protect the blessings of that liberty with our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Very good. Thank you so much. That was very interesting and informative. So many things to talk more about. Do you have a few moments to answer questions from our visitors?
Oh, I'd be delighted. Should I set up the tea?
No, I don't think so, but I think just a few moments here. I want to remind our viewers that you can use the chat function on YouTube to ask your questions. And we're so delighted. We have people from all over the country joining us. Albany, New York, Boston, Massachusetts, Valley Forge, North Carolina, Austin, Washington, D.C., Omaha, Nebraska, and New York City, among others. It's really a great example of our celebration is really truly national. So as we get into the questions, let me start and talk about your travel. Did you travel among the colonies? Did you mostly stay in Massachusetts? I'm curious, or was it that your husband would do those things?
Well, before I was married, I stayed in Connecticut. As I said, I actually stayed at the home of Thaddeus Burr, Aaron Burr, who would later become vice president and has a rather infamous history. Actually, Aaron Burr might have been courting me and tried to steal me away from Mr. Hancock, but it was Aunt Lydia who prevailed in that, and she kept Mr. Burr separate from me at all costs. Anyway, when we married, as I said, I went to Philadelphia with my husband. I would very rarely be apart from him. It was only if I was unwell and unable to travel. There was a time when the Congress actually had to move to Baltimore. Baltimore was not as graceful a city as it might be in your day, and in that day, Baltimore was rather a difficult city to live in. But I did live there. I even had our first daughter there. But then the Congress had to move back. I had just given birth to a child, so I followed a few weeks later. But that's pretty much the extent of my travels. Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then back up to Massachusetts, where I pretty much stayed. I've never been off of these shores like my husband. My husband spent considerable time in London as the agent to his uncle's mercantile business, Thomas Hancock Company.
Mm-hmm. And did your husband wish to be president of the United States?
Oh, well, he would have liked that honor, but it was pretty much a foregone understanding that General Washington would again surpass all in that vote. He then hoped to be vice president of the United States, but he only received 5 votes. John Adams would prevail in that. So he would have liked to have a position of more importance, but at the time he also was governor of Massachusetts, which was a very important position.
You mentioned Abigail Adams. Who were some of your other peers who we might know during that time?
Oh, well, of course, the Otises of Boston and the Warrens of Boston, the Quincys. I am of the Massachusetts Quincys, which descend from the Quincy who signed Magna Carta. So I assure you, the Quincy family will never let anyone forget that important aspect of our history. I've pretty much been socially connected my entire life, but it was truly my connection to my Aunt Lydia, who was a relative on my mother's side, who we made the connection to Mr. Hancock. And my father, you see, Judge Quincy, also was a very important man within Boston. And well, being a judge, of course, he had a position of importance. So his home was always a location of social gathering. And so I grew up basically knowing most of the important families, but I would say with the Warrens and the Otises and the Adamses, we were quite close.
Mhm. Did you support your husband signing the Declaration? Were you concerned about your family's safety?
Well, one is always concerned with family safety, but again, I grew up understanding the necessity of the patriotic cause. My father, again, Judge Quincy, he was an ardent patriot before the Stamp Act was even passed by Great Britain. He was calling for American independence back in the early 60s. So I completely supported the ideas of American independence. Mind you, again, I'm not terribly political, but I do have ears and I do have a mind of my own. But I understood too that as my husband's helpmeet, it was my responsibility to just support his determinations. And I knew that independence was an imperative for the American people. I was indoctrinated to that from the earliest of ages with my father's house.
And you mentioned an interesting point about your background in women's voices. So, how do you feel about the role of women's voices during that time? And could there have been a more leadership or opportunities for women's voices?
Well, I would find it personally very difficult to take on a role of any leadership outside of that of my home sphere. I do consider my responsibility to be that of a wife, and I had hoped to be a mother to raise children to an adult age, but well, sadly, the good Lord didn't give me that opportunity, but that is always what we considered our destiny. I mean, I was well enough educated, but again, never terribly outspoken, not certainly like my cousin Abigail or like my friend Mercy Otis Warren. There were some women who were more outspoken than others, but we women had a responsibility to make sure that our homes were taken care of, that our families were taken care of, and that our communities too would receive the benevolent administrations where we had the withal to give. If there was someone in the community who was unfortunate, then certainly I, as the wife of one of the most wealthy men in Boston, had a responsibility to ensure that if my husband's attention had not been called to their plight, that certainly it would be called and that he could indeed be the philanthropist that he was. So there were other ways for women to reach out and become leaders within the community, in most part, probably by keeping our attention to the homes and to the families in need.
So, other ways to exercise your influence.
I
Very good. Did your husband always sign his name so large on all documents?
Well, actually, yes, that had become quite a habit. When he had began working for his uncle Thomas, you see, my husband was an orphan, and his uncle Thomas took him in at an early age. Uncle Thomas was a very wealthy man, Uncle Thomas and Aunt Lydia, and they had no children of their own, so they took in their nephew, John Hancock, and he became Uncle Thomas's agent in London, and he had many documents to work upon, and those documents needed to be legible. It was very important that one could read what was being sent, make everything so much more efficient. You don't want one mistaking the number 1,000 for 7,000 or something like that.
Mm.
So he had excellent penmanship. He worked on that. And his signature became a source of pride. And yes, indeed, many of the documents that he signed for Congress during those years that he was president all had that wonderful flourish upon them.
Very good. Well, it's quite famous through the ages, as you might be well aware. We're running out of time for this session. There's so many facets of history and this time in our country's founding that we didn't know about. So we appreciate you telling us about our young nation through your eyes.
It was my pleasure to be here.
Very good. Well, as we start to wrap up this session, some of our guests might have noticed that I have yet another wonderful shirt from the National Archives store. And you might be interested in some of our women's collection items. If you weren't on earlier, we have a terrific Declaration shirt by an artist who's made a couple of adjustments to the Declaration, and a wonderful scarf, not quite right for me, but right for the right person. And there is a John Hancock on here in a couple of spots. So if you're interested, the archive store is available at archivesfoundation.org. All day today, we have a sale, 50% off the entire site. If you use the code Liberty50, that's the word Liberty and the number 50 for 50% off. When you visit our website, I hope you'll take a look around at some of the other programs and activities that the foundation supports in Washington, D.C. and around the country to help the archives with its outreach work around the year, and consider membership in the foundation. A special thank you to our sponsors, John Hancock and AARP. Without their support, July 4th at the National Archives wouldn't be possible. And I want to give a special thanks to our members who support us throughout the year. Hopefully you'll tune in for our next and last educational program featuring Brad Meltzer, he's an amazing author, and Chris Iliopoulos, who's a terrific illustrator. They've teamed up for years on a series of books called I Am: How Ordinary People Change the World. Brad's going to talk a little bit about those historical figures that he's featured. Chris is going to draw them live, and then he'll tell you to go get your pen and marker, and he's going to show you how he does his illustrations and how you can too. These guys are a blast, so I hope you'll tune in. On behalf of the National Archives and the National Archives Foundation, thanks again for spending part of your day. And as you're waiting for Brad and Chris to come up at the top of the hour, don't forget us online. Hit us up on social media using the hashtag ArchivesJuly4. Until our next program, wave your flag, enjoy your patriotic day, and happy July 4th.